Okay, so welcome everyone. It's great to see you here. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Yael Shapira, OLAM's Director of Network Engagement and Programs, and I'm excited to delve into yet another topic of ethical best practices through our Aspire program. If you haven't done so yet, please introduce yourself in the chat so we know who's here. So many of you already know about Aspire and have joined us for a number of webinars. But I'll briefly explain about the program for those of you who are new. OLAM's Aspire is a program for our partner organizations that provides information, tools, and resources to improve ethical practices in their work in the topics of ethical communication, community engagement, monitoring evaluation, and global volunteering. On OLAM's website, you will find our 4 ethical spectrums that detail what ethical practices could look like. You'll find information about our microgrants program, offering up to $1,500 per partner organization each year, and includes a list of recommended consultants that you can work with. Additionally, we have a list of useful resources, and if you or your colleagues would like to watch a recording of any of our previous webinars, please let me know. We have a lot of great material out there. In the meantime, save the date for our upcoming 2 Aspire webinars. We have for ethical communications, the words we use and why they matter, and ethical community engagement, a guide to asset-based community development. So again, you can RSVP already on the Aspire website. We'll put the link in the chat. So today's webinar falls under the topic of ethical global service, though it actually relates not only to organizations sending volunteers to host communities, but it's relevant to any organization that partners with local communities or local organizations. The 7th commandment in our ethical spectrum is to establish financial cooperation and openness. We believe that in order to have more equitable power dynamics, it's important to be transparent about finances and to understand who you are accountable to. We hope that after this webinar, you will do some reflection with your team to see if there are changes you could make to achieve best practices. So I'll be sharing this ethical spectrum in a follow-up email, and hopefully you'll be able to read and get some understanding of examples for this. And now I am thrilled to pass it along to our speaker, Kelly Borer. She is the Executive Director of the Ethos Center and Director of Community Relations in the School of Engineering at the University of Dayton in Ohio. She is an educator, boundary spanner, practitioner scholar, and social justice and sustainability education consultant with 25 years of experience partnering with community organizations and working in higher education. You'll be able to ask some questions in the end after the presentation and small group activity. So now I'll pass it along to Kelly, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, let me begin the presentation too. All right. As Yael said, my name is Kelly Borer, and I work at the University of Dayton, and I'm delighted to be with you here today to talk about this really important aspect of the work that I do and that I know that many of you do. When we talk about working internationally, transnationally with NGOs and community-based organizations, and then in particularly today around ethical global service. So we in the Ethos Center at the University of Dayton, we actually work with community organizations around the world, both domestically and in other countries, on what we hope and what we strive for are transformative partnerships as opposed to transactional partnerships. So instead of a one and done project where our students or our faculty and staff are going to a particular country and getting a project done and coming back, we're actually in a long-term relationship and partnership with community-based organizations that are hyper-local based in local communities and working with those communities and are a part of those communities to really forward their community development goals or other goals that they have. We are in the engineering school, so we are bringing some technical mindset and expertise, but we certainly do a lot of preparation with our students, faculty, and staff around the fact that we aren't necessarily the expert, the only expert, or experts at all, especially when we send students, engineering students, to these places. they have a little dose of intellectual humility, realizing if you can't do something here in the US as an engineering student, you certainly can't do it anywhere else. So we talk a lot about how they bring their engineering and technical mindset and skill set, and not necessarily expertise, knowledge, and know-how. So the other piece of our programming is cultural immersions. And so our students, when they go, they are fully culturally immersed. So they're going for 10 to 15 weeks, depending on the semester. And they are spending an entire semester course preparing for those immersions. Faculty and staff are engaged with each partnership as we develop technologies and work with the communities on implementing the technology, sustaining the technologies, and doing it based on what their needs, their hopes, their aspirations. So in that context, I am happy to be talking about how do we do this ethical financial transactions and moving it beyond just transactions. How do we bring it into our relationships and really think through how it matches what we say and do? To kick off, we are first going to do a short little poll that actually Yael is going to post. So I'm gonna have her do I need to stop sharing for you to do that?
The poll has disappeared for me. So okay. Go ahead and we can get back to that. Sorry about that.
That's okay. So as we're searching for that poll, I am going to go ahead and move along. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we're going to talk about. Here's an overview. So we'll start with just a very basic question around, do our practices match our values? Then some foundational frameworks, guidelines, and principles that we certainly look towards as we think about how we do the financial aspects of our work. And I hope that will also help you look forward to that as well. Then I will go into specifically fair trade learning principles and rubric, which is something that our university I think that there might be somebody to mute. Yeah, okay, you're on that. Great. And then how we work towards those ideals, actions you can specifically take. And then we're going to get an opportunity to actually practice some of the things that we talk about today in case studies and test and group dialogue, as well as question and answers would be at the end of the session today. So our journey begins with, do our practices match our values? So I always like to start with a question. I think inquiry-based learning is the best type of learning. So let's think about what are our practices, very personally our practices, but maybe more in general, our practices, maybe especially coming from the idea of the Western practices or the global North practices, if you will. And what we are doing in our financial sphere of our work, does it match our values in the same way that perhaps the way we meet with people, talk with people, work with people, which we will often say we're trying to do out of cultural humility and being, in a right relationship with people. Does that translate also to our financial practices? So some images here to get our juices thinking about what might be practices that actually do not demonstrate, are not aligned with our values. I think everybody is pretty familiar, or hopefully familiar with seeing the graph at the bottom there in the middle, or hearing about this, about the income disparity. And this is particularly just in the United States, but we all know there's global inequality. It's not just in the United States. And what this really calls to our attention is, where does the funding and the success of financials, where does that ultimately end up? Is it ending up in a way that's actually causing that inequality to grow, or is it ending up in a way where we're actually reducing that inequality? And what are the practices that cause it to do what we don't want it to do? And what are the practices that we can use to actually close that gap? Other ways that we can think about our financial practices, how's it impacting our planet? Right? So not even just looking at the communities that we are working with, but their local environment and the broader view of our environment, and how might it be impacting climate change, for instance. We can also look at, where is the money staying? Where is the money coming from? What is our footprint on the community? So when we come with all of our volunteers or with all of our staff, how are we impacting that community in positive ways and avoiding harm? So all considerations to think about. So I particularly like this quote that I was reading a couple of articles with Verge magazine, which is about ethical tourism. And I particularly like this quote because I think it fits so well. And how do we think about the entire supply chain of what we're doing to ensure that our dollars and actions benefit and not harm both local communities and environments? And I just think that this just embraces the entire concept of thinking about supply chains and life cycles from the beginning to the end, from the earning of the money to the spending of the money, and how is it in always benefiting and not harming. And I think that's the essential that this comes down to, is the do no harm, but also do good. So that is a quote that really stood out for me. The bottom quote actually is from some literature about fair trade learning and the community-based global learning collaborative that I'm going to mention in a minute. And that bottom quote, what really stands out to me is the amount of tourism money that stays in a local community. And so according to United Nations Environmental Program, it is only 5% of tourism dollars that stay in the communities. This is even true when we talk about global service and when we talk about having volunteers come and work in communities, or even having staff be in communities and working with local communities, particularly in the global South. We're talking, in general, 5%, only 5% of the funding that would be spent in that instance of having volunteers be there or having staff be there and working on whatever is happening in the community, only 5% of the dollars stay there. Certainly we know there's not much you can do about airplane flights, which is a significant portion of the cost, other than we can think about how we can do carbon offsetting or carbon onsetting with our airplane flights. But I think what our goal is not only closing that inequality gap, but it's also saying, how can we, if we're really, this is all about that community and our partnership and our relationship together, how does more of the money go to that local community? And that's really what this is about. So some foundations for thinking about financially ethical practices. Certainly we can turn to international humanitarian and human rights laws. And some of the key guiding principles of human rights laws include rights and obligations, the universality of human rights, that the human rights are based on dignity of people, that simply because you are a person, you are born with dignity and you have that universality of rights. And then equal and non-discriminatory. So rights across the board equal, totally and completely across the board, and we're not going to discriminate. And so I think that that is a really great universal foundation that we can draw on for guiding our financial practices. A lot of people, especially I'm at a Catholic university, so a lot of different organizations, and we probably know a lot of NGOs that are particularly drawn to this work or doing this work in light of their faith traditions. And so some principles that those faith traditions might draw from include subsidiarity, solidarity, and stewardship. And I apologize, it's subsidiarity. That's one of those words that always gets my tongue tied a little bit. And these are all three concepts that help us, again, think about the entire supply chain, closing the inequality gap, and bringing more of that money to the local communities, because it shows how we honor the relationship and how we're trying to do no harm, but also to benefit the local community. Certainly, we can turn to sustainability and the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Those are certainly important aspects of the foundations that we can go to, and we can look at the different tools for assessment in the Sustainable Development Goals to guide what we do. Do no harm, I've already mentioned, and I did notice there was a really great presentation about this on webinar number 1 under the Do No Harm series on the OLAM website, so check that out. And then last but not least is that concept of fair trade. Giving people a fair reward is treating them in a just way. And that fair trade piece also is about how do we ensure fair trade working conditions and compensation in local communities, especially when we're talking about global service. So that would be, does the local community have the opportunity to hold significant voice in the orchestration of the programming? And are they offered proper professional development opportunities, as well as fully and equitably compensated for the work? So in a minute, I'm going to stop and ask if you have any questions, but there's more that we can pull from that is happening more recently, some long overdue shifts that are happening in the field, particularly in international aid field, but also in the global service, ethical global service field as well. There's been, I would say probably in the past 5 to 10 years, a huge movement to really dig into the ethical practices of this and how we might be perpetuating systems such as colonialism, racism, and other such unjust structures. So there's a lot of literature. You can type into Google decolonizing aid and you'll get a million articles to read and that are from organizations and even some government entities, UN entities that will talk about decolonizing aid. So certainly an important topic to think about is how do we shift the power, shift the control to the communities so that they can be self-reliant, self-determined, and have their own self-efficacy as well as develop in the ways that they aspire to. This does include embracing a transition mindset. So we have to have this mindset that maybe we are actually working to put ourselves out of business, and that's a good thing. And we're shifting the power and resources to the local communities that we work with. Genuine localization. And what I mean by genuine localization is when we talk about local, when we say localization, do we really mean local? Do we really mean the people who live there, who work there, who have their futures there, their children there, their past there? Are they a part of the process? And are we looking at it inclusively, not just the leaders, not those that have the privilege of power because of different social identities in that community, but we're truly being inclusive as well. So we have to question what we mean by localization. More bottom-up approaches are needed. So bottom-up approaches is the community involved in thinking about this is what we believe our needs are, and here are some of the practices that will and will not work. And so really trusting the local communities and embracing our assumptions and our bias and really criticizing our assumptions and bias and thinking they have the expertise about their own culture and their own community. And why have we always practiced in a way where we don't think that they do? Change framing to reparations, not aid. So there's a lot of literature in the decolonizing aid world that talks about when we are talking about international aid, when we're talking about financing to these other countries, is it aid or is it reparations for ways that we have done harm in the past? And then last but not least, even the United Nations has published something called the New Way of Working, where they are also suggesting that we really need to embrace local resiliency and stop the dependency on aid that we actually have the power over and the ability to stop. So how can these shifts happen if Western norms remain privileged in our work? And I would say if we all took a moment to really examine our work, we will see it creep into our work in unexpected ways and maybe in ways that we aren't even aware of, that we are favoring Western ways, Western knowledge, Western resources. So how do we do this if power remains with headquarters and if funding always comes with strings attached? I don't know how many of you know about global map projections. I love mapping. I'm a GIS fan, and I really love the ability of maps to show us quite a lot. These are two different typical map projections. The one on the left is called the Mercator projection, where Africa looks to be about the same size as the United States. When in reality, it is completely not the same size as the United States. It's much larger than the continent of Africa, and comparing it to United States, or even you can compare it to the continent of North America. So on the right, it's called equal Earth projection. So it's trying to get more of an equality of the land masses. Of course, it distorts it because projections are challenging, but it's trying to get at the equal size. So even in the way we show our maps, what world map is on your wall? I'm going to stop there for a second and see if anybody has any questions before moving on, and also to check to see if we have the poll available.
Yes, on the poll.
Oh, do you want to go ahead and do it?
Yes, that's Angela. Thank you.
So a poll for you all to respond to.
Are you seeing it, Kelly?
I am seeing the results, yeah.
Wonderful.
Oh, is it not showing up on my screen? Can you see the results?
No, but
so I'm not sure there's a launch poll button at the bottom of my screen, but currently we have 81% participated. The question, who manages the finance in your organization? Top response so far is staff at HQ at 33%. Followed actually trumped by both HQ and partner staff at 44%, you at 11%, and no assigned role at 11%. So 81% participated. So if anyone else wants to join in the poll, go ahead.
Thank you, Angela, for sharing that. Great. So, and is there an option that on there that someone's like, wait, but I would have picked something else, but it's not there? That's a curiosity.
I'm not sure, but we definitely have 90% participation. So I think everyone started choosing what they want to do.
Okay, great. All right. Thanks everybody for participating in that. Any other questions before we move on?
Feel free to unmute yourself or put in the chat. And I see Jonathan has written he would have picked headquarters and country office staff along with partners as another option.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan, for doing that. Yeah, great.
Several of us have asked about subsidiarity, which I think is a Catholic notion that we're not familiar with.
Yeah, so it probably does come more from the Catholic tradition. That is true. It basically is the principle that local is best. So really, truly, it's about shifting all the power to locally. So the local context knows best about their context, and so all decisions. So when you think about a decision that you need to make, especially a financial decision, if the local community can make that decision and has the resources to make that decision, then they should be the ones making that decision and taking care of that part of civil society. Basically, the higher up levels, the national level, international level, should not be doing what a local community can do for themselves. But of course, there are structures in which there are some things that a local community cannot do. And so the next best, in the United States, the next best structure would be at the state level. If the state can't do it, the next level obviously would be the national government. So it is this hyper-localization, shifting the power to the local community. So thank you so much for bringing that up. I appreciate that. Great.
I have a question.
Yes.
Let me put on my video. In Kelowna, we care very much about accounting and accountability, and we require it of communities, and we require them, at least in some cases, to learn to keep records and to share them with and to report back to us. That's not necessarily their tradition or their skill set. So in a sense, I don't know if I'm being colonial in imposing the requirement of, I know that some people in the community want others in the community to be accountable and to be transparent, but sometimes there may be a culture of having a chief in the community who's in charge who doesn't want to tell everybody else what's going on. And so sometimes even the values of accountability and transparency, it seems to me, are our values that we're imposing.
Yeah, so I love that you brought that up, because I bring that up a little bit later in the presentation. So thanks for the prompt. But I think it might be even good to talk about right now. So some of these values, you're right, absolutely. And a lot of the literature talks about transparency and accountability and the Western notions of that, and how might that translate into other cultures. I don't think anybody has said too much about it, because when we talk about other cultures, I mean, we're talking about extremes from, a rural community in Ghana to a rural community in Bolivia. So even those differences in cultures are going to be, take a look at transparency and accountability in different ways. And I think this is really important to be on the ground and have that partnership and that relationship with the local community. So when you talk about the money that goes into it, first of all, are they aware that there's a lot of money that goes into bringing volunteers there or the programs that you're helping to support or advising? And then how do they talk about that? How do they talk about the sharing of those resources, and how they want to share or not share, and why they want to share and not share? There's an example that really got the fair trade learning movement going, where Amazadi was working with a group in Jamaica, and it was homestays. And the mothers that were part of determining the price of the homestays wanted to raise the price. And it really was going to be a challenge financially for Amazadi. But then they went back and said, this is actually going to be a challenge, but I love that you all are forming kind of like a co-op model of homestays, and we want to embrace that, and we really want you to make your own decisions for your community, because they were even talking about finding ways to spread the income that came from them homestays so they would share it through the years. I think that only came from being in relationship and being open and honest. So we don't have to call it transparency or accountability, but it's really about talking about what are the needs here, what do we have, what do you have, what are our assets? I don't know if anybody, I think this room is full of experts and all of you all have worked many years in this realms. What are other thoughts on that?
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah, good.
So yeah, I think I really agree with what Harriet said from my experience as well. Of course, just talking about the more of the critical point of view, the local culture or the local traditions, in many cases, they can be, on top of what Harriet said, they can be chauvinist, misogynist, they can be hierarchy, like, for example, my experience working in India and Nepal, caste system is very strong in the local tradition, and the distribution of resources follow the caste system. Working now in West Africa, chiefhood is very prominent, and if you want to do anything, you have to go through the chief, and the chief will take his cut. Same goes with government, local government. It's the local tradition. This is how things work over there, even regardless to international organizations or international bodies. There is no support by central government. They have to survive somehow, and the way of surviving is taking cuts of activities that are going on and preserving their power and preserving the hierarchy that benefits them in many cases. So I was wondering, like, how do you see that fits into this kind of approach, to this kind of theory of working with the local knowledge and local social structures and so on?
Yeah, you raise an excellent question around what are some of the challenges in the field, and what we see as barriers. So I love questions. So I always flip it around to a question or a way of thinking, which is one, is that really any different? And I'm not sure if you're in the United States or not, but certainly in the United States and probably in many aspects of Europe, is it really any different than how we work? And two, what could have been the reason for those systems and those traditions? Are they a very heavy, deep, long-term tradition, or were those protective measures that communities have developed over the past 400 years in light of colonization and other things that have happened in the world. And our world becoming a global economy, and has really made it, not only have we been able to form really great relationships, but it's also made it very competitive and very unequal, as we were showing earlier in the seminar. So to flip that question around and go, well, how much of that is true for my own community, where I'm from? And then how much is that actually a cause of the way that we work with those local communities from the outside of the communities? And then just to find ways to support the local community that it doesn't in a new way. And I think it has to be innovative. And so, for example, this local one that I was talking about from Jamaica, where it was the homestay mothers, the leaders of the community were actually trying to take over the process. And Amazadi was very straightforward with the leaders, like, we're not working through you. We're working with the group of women who are hosting these homestays. And they were just adamant about it and kept on repeating why and what the values were and what was important about it. And the community leaders eventually did say, okay, this is something that that can be done, that we're okay with, because that's going to keep our relationship, and it's going to keep this global service program continuing. And I think those are some questions that we have to ask, and then to think creatively and innovatively about how is our presence possibly shaping some of those hierarchical dynamics too. So I know it doesn't give an answer.
but you just said two different things, because you said first thing, like if you are looking for an answer, so no, like where I live in Israel and other places, I know it's not corrupted like that, and people don't take cuts of public funding and social causes. And then you said also that you were able to work directly with the women, which is not the traditional way of working. So you said basically that you were able to shortcut, find a way to work directly with the women, which is not their traditional 400 years old local cultural structures and so on. This is something you invented. So, and again, I said it also in my question, this is how without international organization, with international organization, doesn't matter. When a local person, when a farmer wants to do something in his community, he has to go through the chief. If he's related to the chief, if it's a family member, he will get support. If he's a refugee, he will not get support. If he's a refugee, the cost of water will be twice as much. If he's a supporter of the chief, the cost of water will be free. So it's not related to our work. This was established before foreigners came to those places.
Sorry, I'm just gonna note that we're running out of time for the presentation. So Ben, it's really important comments, and hopefully people can respond from their experience in the chat. But I'd love to pass it back to Kelly if you 5 minutes or 7 minutes, try to get through the rest of the presentation.
Yeah, sure.
We'll get back to questions in the end. Thank you.
I apologize, sorry.
Yeah, no, and that might be directly applicable to the case studies. So hang on. Okay, so moving along here then, and now I feel like my screen has just frozen up. Here we go. So where I am coming from, and I'm just going to briefly mention this slide, you'll have it, you'll be able to go back to the webinar, but to mention this slide, the Community-Based Global Learning Collaborative is a collaborative that our university has committed to. And so different universities and NGOs can make a commitment to this collaborative. And part of that collaborative, there are principles, there are standards, and it includes not only relationships and community centeredness and even student learning and how to do these in ways that aren't extractive, but it also talks about finances. And the two primary ways that it talks about there's two primary ways it talks about finances and transparency, and then really around this sustainability, economic sustainability and community voice perspective. So I'm just going to briefly show you some of the principles that they have that can guide you if you're using this as a framework for evaluating your own organization, your own work, which is what we do here in the Ethos Center. So for example, community voice and direction, you're giving significant community direction and feedback. So meeting with several different groups in the community to get their feedback about how the relationship is going, including the financials. Transparency, how funds are spent and why is transparent for all. So to be open and honest about this is how much it costs to send a student here and this is where that money is going and coming from. Environmental sustainability, so if there's going to be local impact mediation because of staff or volunteers being there, how are we going to mediate that? And then economic sustainability, aligned with local economies or social dynamics of the community, which is kind of what you were mentioning, and then ensure responsible management of funds. Easier said than done, right? All of this, these are all ideals. And it's hard to strive for ideals, but I think it's important to know the ideals and strive for them and find practices to get there. And then last but not least, local sourcing is a huge piece of the Fair Trade Learning Community Standards now. And that local sourcing is also a part of the UN's new way of working, as well as decolonizing aid. And this is about maximizing economic benefits to local residents. So for instance, when we send a student for 10 to 12 weeks to work with one of our partners in Chile, the 100% of funds that it takes to send that student there, obviously the airplane I'm going to take out for a second, but how can all of the housing, services, food, and local transportation and other local product service needs all be in the local community? All of that money goes to the local community. So it's not supporting another national entity in that community or a corporation in that community, but literally the economy of that community. So local sourcing is super important. Okay, and then like I mentioned, with these fair trade principles such as local sourcing, you can use this as a framework to evaluate. And they actually have put together a rubric that you can run through, much like the one that Aspire has. So you can actually look at, well, what's the idea when we're talking about local sourcing? What is the ideal we're striving for? But if we're not there yet, where are we at and what do we need to do to get there? I find that a lot of times, even in the Ethos Center, we're like, okay, we're at intermediate, we're kind of getting to advanced. How do we get to that ideal? And it is challenging. It takes a lot of conversations with the community partner and with your staff on how do we need to change? And that's exactly where we're going next, is how do we need to change and how do we do it? So since we only have a few minutes, so some ways to work with these ideals and get there, and then I'll just run through these like 3 slides, Yael, and then we can pause. I think the most important one, and I mentioned this already, is how does our mindset shape our practices? So it's really important for us to also examine internally and do some reflexivity on our own organization and our own selves and our own practices. So we have to start with what assumptions and beliefs do we as a group or individually have about what success looks like, how money is earned, and then what do we do with the money we earn, how we look at money, who owns money, how we look at the host community. Are we looking at them as deficit-based or asset-based? Do we see that they have expertise, knowledge, traditions and culture, and the ability for self-resiliency? Or are we looking at them in a deficit way? And why? Developing nations, how do we look at developing nations? Do we look at them as only corrupt because we've seen so much of that, or at least we've heard a lot about that, or could there be assets? Ways to alleviate poverty, the ways we look at knowledge and expertise. Do we think that only people with PhDs have knowledge and expertise, or do people have lived experience expertise? And then how does this change when we think about our own community versus being in other communities? And how does this change when we consider if the money is from selling something versus earning the money versus getting the money through a donation? So running through this is, I think, the most important part to really examine where are some of our biases coming from. And then just to highlight a few others, and I've said this a lot, shifting power to local communities. So we're allowing the work to be designed, implemented, and validated by the communities we serve. So the accountability actually switches and turns to be to those receiving the services, receiving the aid, receiving the volunteers, working with the volunteers. How are we accountable to them? Then equitably compensate. Yeah, we might compensate the local community in various ways, but is it equitable? Are we compensating them not just for hands-on work the day of, but for the planning that they've had to do as well, and the conversations and collecting the materials or what else is needed in that local area? Are we compensating them for that? Are we investing in their Indigenous knowledge? And then are we ensuring equity in salaries between local and foreign staff? And if we're not, again, let's go back to the slide before, let's examine our assumptions of why we're not. Lastly, how do we highlight local organizations and change makers when we find those positive instances where we seemingly don't see corruption? How do we highlight that? When we see a young person become innovative and start working with their community, how do we highlight those stories so that we're highlighting all the positive stories, we're giving recognition and appreciation for the local communities with their own local resilience? And then there's several other things that we can consider that will be available to you. And the next couple of slides after this also gives you specific concrete actions that your organization can do. So I'm going to go to that. And what volunteers and expatriate staff can do. So expat, we kind of like group in the same area as volunteers in regards to these questions about when you go to a location for however long you're going for, a year, 2 years, or 10 to 12 weeks, like our students, how do we encourage them to spend their money locally for everything? Cultural excursions, their food, their housing, entertainment, art, culture, how was that all spent locally? So I think that's where I'm going to end so that we can jump in, have some time for the case studies. And so I'm assuming we'll see a flood back into the room here in a second.
Yes. And a good number, it's the majority of people who registered here. So I'm very pleased.
Very pleased about that. That is wonderful. All right, I see everybody flooding back into the room. And so as you can probably guess, I'm going to ask that person that you put as your point person to give a brief summary. So what I would ask you to do if you can do it within 1 minute, this will be your challenge of the day, is to say really quick, what was the context of your case study? And then what were some insights? And if your group didn't get to insights and you just got to a lot of challenging problems, maybe summarize those as well. So if we could have group 1 with the first case study to do the summary. Did you all designate a person to go?
I can speak.
Great, thank
Basically,
you.
Our group, we kind of had a overarching discussion, I guess, in some way of the topic in general, and only got to the case study towards the last few minutes. Okay. And so we didn't really we weren't fully discussing all of the questions. Or really much of the case study in general, to be completely honest. But looking at the case study itself, I think it's basically talking about like a group arriving and bringing gifts to children in the community. And I think just like one of the big things that is just in general, like the potential negative consequences is also one of the things is the community potentially being dependent or believing also that, you know, anyone who's coming into their community will be giving them gifts and kind of believing that as the kind of norm and, you know, as their way to get something. I guess this wasn't specific on what kind of gifts, but I've seen in the field, whether it's candy or money or any sort of thing, it kind of just creates this weird and not so good kind of dynamic of kind of that expectation and potentially not necessarily then, you know, going to think for them, going to get that for themselves or whatever it might be, just that kind of dependency in some way. And the accountable people might be in the end of the day, the NGO potentially to not have told, you know, to have that been kind of a thing before to not have the group do.
Right. Yeah. So that prep, the training, that it needs to exclusively be a part of the training. And if hopefully there's a gift policy, so you can even share that gift policy all throughout the preparation and even the day of, like, again, here's our gift policy. That case study, I just want to mention really briefly, also gets to a couple of other things around supply chain and local sourcing. So things were bought in the US, so money was spent in the US to bring to that country, or bought in the, you know, the Western global North to bring to that country. So is that needed? Could we have spent that money locally? Giving the gifts directly out to the children without the permission of the parents, and probably there might not have been enough for all the children, and so then you're going to set up, you know, all sorts of wonky expectations and relationships as well in that regard. So there's a lot actually to that case study that you can dig into, and I invite you to use these case studies with your teams and think through all the different situations. Oh, good. So check out the chat. Yael said that there's some great ethical gift giving policies. So excellent. Group 2, if you could give a summary.
Sure, I can do this really quickly. Basically, it was an NGO in Malawi that worked hyper locally. They bring volunteers in who stay in a very Western style guest house with luxuries. And there are both expats and local people working for the NGO, but they're paid drastically differently. So kind of the risks were what happens when local people see that they're paid so differently, and they also don't get to stay in the local guest house. That's very nice and luxurious that the volunteers get to stay in. They come, they teach, and they go back home. And so we just had a few points of discussion. Number one was actually it's probably, well, one of the people in the group said it's probably fair that people are paid a local wage because you don't want to create this dependence that's unsustainable by paying different wages. And then Ben brought up a great point, which I would have loved to talk about more, but we had to leave the group, and it's why do we even need volunteers and expats working there in the first place? So that's about as far as we got.
I love that. I wish you had more time to dig into that, because I bring up that question all the time with my staff. It's like, well, let's stop. Let's go to the extreme. Why are we even there? So thank you for sharing.
I'd love to.
One more idea was the option of having the community build the guest house and host the guests rather than create an NGO run guest house.
Yes, right. So that, again, local sourcing, right? Because you're right. So that was probably supported by donor money, and the money probably is going back to helping increase wealth outside of the community. So thank you for sharing that. Yeah.
I just wanted to add one thing. It wasn't specifically in this case study or something mentioned, but something to think about that I don't know if many of us do is just the expat lifestyle, which a lot of us go into this field of work because of it. And I've experienced this myself, of going to a country and basically having like a separate economy, going to, you know, all the best bars and restaurants and living in great houses. And, you know, and it's fun to meet people from around the world and have this kind of lifestyle. But I guess it's hard to ask the questions of, should the money be going to that? Why are we so different? You know, are our partners in the community coming to these restaurants as well? Probably not. So just,
right.
I think another hard question to ask ourselves.
Right. Yeah. And thank you for sharing that. I think that's even important when students or volunteers go for, you know, 10 to 12 weeks. Our students used to, I found out years ago, like they would do all these weekend excursions, and they're like, well, that would be our entertainment. Well, how else are we going to entertain ourselves? I'm like, why don't you have a family, you're in a homestay. Why aren't you doing what the culture would do? Like, how are they spending their time? So we have to ask these hard questions. Okay, case study 3.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jonathan, and this is on behalf of Nikki and Emma. Basically, the situation was we were working with a women's group, and they were needing to front some expenses around transportation or just other upfront expenses, and the local partner didn't have a finance person. So basically, the HQ-based finance person had to sit there and approve every single expense. So Obviously changing power dynamics from a very, patriarchal one where you're basically having to ask for your allowance, and also is really harmful because some people don't have disposable income to front and wait for a reimbursement. One of the policies that I work for Care USA, we frequently advance funding, where we'll advance people part or all of the entire line item, and then just ask for documentation once that's been expended about what it was expended for.
Great, thank you also for sharing one of your practices. That's really helpful. And a part of that case study is also about accountability and who are we accountable to? Who drives the accountability of our organization? Is it our donors or is it the people that we're working with? And I also want to throw out there, what about the accountability to our workers, to our employees? And a lot of people say, all the accountability should be shifted to those we're working with. But we also have to recognize that for us to work well as well, for our employees to work well, they need well-being as well. And so what is our accountability and responsibility to the well-being of our employees as well is important. So I think we're at the end of time.
Yeah, we're at the end of the time. Sorry, it's rushed as usual. Kelly has kindly agreed to stay on for a bit longer if anyone wants to hang out, ask questions, have a bit of a discussion, since these are big topics. But if you have to go, thank you so much for joining us today, and thanks to Kelly. And I will be sending out a follow-up email with a recording, with her presentation and some more resources for you. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm happy to stay on. But if anybody has questions, or even if you want me to bring back up the slides and we can talk through some of the actions to take, or what can lead us in thinking through what actions we can take. Happy to do that. So just let me know.
I wanted to bring up something that came up from the discussion in our group. Yeah. We didn't have time to talk about it, group 2. But when you talk about why have expats or foreign volunteers, I think at least our approach at NALA is the same as looking at materials or services. It's better to locally source staff, volunteers. It's the same, working with local staff and volunteers. But if you already bring expats and volunteers from outside to a community, it's this lifestyle, this type of work, it's really hard. You have a lot of things you give up to do this type of work. So when you talk about why people want to go to excursions and travel and get clear their minds, it's because this is kind of the, not reward, but it's the advantages. It's part of the advantages of doing this type of work. So when sending someone to the field, that you decide on sending them, you have to understand that this is how they get rewarded for everything that they give up on. Again, the best practice is not to send anyone, is to use local staff and volunteers.
Yeah, right, exactly. And that's the ideal. Again, how do we strive for that ideal? In the meantime, what are we doing? And that's why I brought up that last piece that I did about accountability to our staff, which we could stretch to say also accountability to volunteers about their well-being. We cannot ignore the well-being of those that are doing any of the work or volunteering or planning or implementing on the ground locally. Their well-being is very important. So thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate that.
I think you raised a good question about who are the people who are going there. The real question is, what is my contribution? And I think I'm living in Israel, and there are a lot of young people who are going and working with local communities, and they're learning how this is working. And I would think what they have to bring is some of the new technology that's developing in Israel. But otherwise, their main, I think, obstacle is the lack of local knowledge, the use of local knowledge and local organization, which varies tremendously. My experience has been in Africa for over 40 years. And I've worked with a friend, it's 99%, who's a Senegalese, is 99% Africanized project. And he just takes somebody like me to have an outside view of the bigger picture and how it fits in with the aid agency that's financing the project. Now, when he goes into a project, he says, here is what we are going to do. If you're not willing to do this, then I won't work with you. And that eliminates the question of, oh, the chief, I want my cut, as somebody said. And it really works because his staff are recruited locally or from the same region. They speak the same language and they know who are the hustlers. See, I've worked 60 years and I know who the NGOs who are hustlers. And you can tell the hustlers by the ones who suddenly change. If the money is in health, they say we're a health organization. The money is in that, we're in agriculture. The money is in women, we're youth. They change all the time. And what they're interested is in getting the four-wheel drive and per diems and the government people. And I've worked in projects like a health project where the government wasn't interested because there was no per diem. So there was a health project in Benin. I don't want to spend, I can give you millions of examples about this. And my friend Papa said, who works for CLUSA, which is, I don't know if you've heard of CLUSA, Cooperative League USA, now it's national. He has an internal democracy principles, and the people that he worked with, they have to accept it. Internal nonpartisanship and independence, in other words, not being picked by a politician. Collaboration, rather confrontation between citizens and local government, because we haven't very often, these organizations, they work with the community, but not with the local government institutions. And you really need the partnership because they have a lot of the power, decision-making power and resources. And they also need the support of the local community to make the argument at the national level. Yeah. And then we want to give the priority of the design, what the priorities are, and you make an inventory, not just of needs, which is what typical projects do, but of the human resources in the community. So, and the scale, you see, people in the West, we don't think, oh, we're not gonna have a project where you give 5 goats to a poor woman, but that's what they're doing. And giving 5 goats to a poor woman may pull them out of poverty. Or
you're bringing up,
and you're
bringing up some great points that actually I want to share. I do want to share a slide real quick that I had to fly past because we ran out of time. Can you see this okay? What can organizations do?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I think you're bringing up what some of the things that organizations can do. And so at the bottom, I think about like, how can you use your mission and values as criteria to think through financial practices, such as who your donors are, the life cycle of products and services you buy and sell, transportation, gifting, staff. But another piece of this really is also what you're bringing up is, how do our practices undermine good things or things that we hope could have the potential to be good, such as civil society? So are we encouraging partnerships with civil society? And what do we do about it when we know that maybe some of it is corrupt? And I think those are really good questions to ask, because ultimately a lot of what we from the West, our aid and our work really could be civil society taking care of each other, right, locally. And it's not happening for a variety of reasons, one of them being that they were once most likely colonized, but for a variety of other reasons as well, globalization, global economy. But I think that's really important to ask the question, if they aren't partnering with the civil society, why? And then is the civil society, have they felt like, oh, well, you're taking care of everything, I'm checking out, right? So I think there's some really good questions to ask around who in the local community is or is not partnering as well. And then we were talking earlier about, it's okay if you decide that's not the best that's not the best community or the local based organizations to partner with. If they're doing something that doesn't fit your ethical practices, it's okay to say and be very transparent. we just can't, like this cultural piece, we understand it's a part of your culture, but it just doesn't fit our ethical practices. We don't believe that this is correct, and we're just not going to be able to partner. And that's okay to say that. And sometimes it's a good thing to say that, so that we can be accountable to everyone. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing. Other thoughts from others? And like I said, I'm happy to go back to other slides as well.
Okay, I'm sorry I missed the case study. It didn't appear on my screen. It may be I'm old and I don't have the technology to keep track. So I didn't see the case study. I was in group 1, and I'm very African. See, part of the thing, if you to get the contact, you need to spend a lot of time. It isn't like I'll have a 7-10 minute meeting.
Right.
I had a discussion. I was supposed to organize focus groups, and when the organizer said those 45 minutes, and you can't have a focus group with 8 or 10 people and only be 45. The introductions will take 10 minutes.
That's right.
So you have to respect that part of the local culture and spend the time. And that's why it's not administratively, financially viable to bring high-paid experts to go into small areas and spend a lot of time. That's why you need the local people, and you need in Africa the Africanization of the organizations, and you need a knowledge of not just the technical sector you're working in, but the political, how people make their livelihoods, the demographic balance, like women are taking more responsibility because young men have left, so women are becoming heads of family. All these factors have to be integrated. The culture.
Sheldon, I'll plug in all our webinars about ethical community engagement, which go hand in hand with this. You have to have real relationships and understanding, and equal partnership with a local community in order for your finances to be able to run equitably. We do have a question in the chat here. What do you do about transactions that require bribes? I think that's a really big issue, issue, and relates to ethical practices. What are your values, your ethics? Kelly or anyone else, if you want to respond.
Yeah, I think that's and I'll just respond really quick. I think you have to think carefully about those situations, because in some instances, what we might call a bribe, it isn't universally accepted as the negative intention we put on a bribe, right? So this is where it gets really tricky, because you have to think about the cultural context, the meaning we put on it from our perspective, and then what expectations does it set up, good or bad, and then what is expected in return. So again, this is where it's really important to build that relationship and not be transactional. So if we're there long term and we're talking and we're understanding the culture and we're meeting with lots of people and we understand that that's a part of the culture, and it actually means I am in relationship with you, and if that gift wasn't happening, it would mean like, oh, you're just a transaction. You're not a part of relationship. So those are really important things to really dig deep into and try to understand, and to talk with your staff. Decide what is ethical, where do you draw the line, and where does it make sense? And again, if you have to draw the line that says we're not okay with that, then maybe that's not the right community to be partnering with. So, and yeah, please, I realize I'm in a room of experts. So please, if anybody else has a concrete response to that, please do share.
I think the per diem system that was and still supported by UN agencies and large agencies that control a huge proportion of the field are really making it difficult to work in that kind of way of working where government and people are used to get money to participate. They're used to get like something in return, even if they have a salary from the government, even if especially when we're talking about small scale, like one community, like a village, like an area, it's more feasible. But when you talk about large scale program that works with thousands of farmers and so on, and you need like a lot of government involvement, and it's really difficult. They don't call it bribes, they call it per diem, or you know, but that's just talking about the general kind of per diem / bribe culture. But of course, there is also like direct bribe culture. Like you want to get a working visa, you need to pay bribe. You want to get your NGO registered, you need to pay bribe. Otherwise, they will lose the file. They will lose the file 10 times until you give them some money. So this kind of stuff, and you have like already donors that you're committed to and millions of dollars and so on and so on. So you say, okay, I'll just pay this like $200 or whatever to get my organization registered, so I can work and not fail on the communities I'm committed to. Right. So this is another part of bribes that we have to deal with.
Yes. And how many of us came into this field going, this is a piece of cake. We're just going to go and do international aid and figure out how to make the world more equitable and just. And it's highly complex. It's super complex. I mean, you all are bringing up great instances of how complex it is. And I think that's, again, where it's helpful to talk about this and maybe create as an organization, and I did put that at the top of this one, what can organizations do? Create an assessment, maybe start with the Fair Trade Learning rubric or the Aspire rubrics, spectrums, and use those and share them with the communities you're working with and go, what is it that we want to track? What is it that we want to look at? What's complicated here, and how are we going to figure out this complication? When I talk to my colleagues who are not in this field, they are always so baffled and so surprised by all the different questions we have to keep on asking. So if we ask an ethical question, another ethical question comes up, and then it's like, you know, you can see the flow chart, you know, like if this then, and you've got like 10 choices, and then if this then, and that flow chart is huge because of all these different instances and cultural pieces of the world, which is both beautiful but challenging. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Kelly. You've already stayed on beyond, and I will let you get going to the rest of your day. I hope this was useful to everyone. And as always, we hope that these webinars are like a spark of a conversation you're going to have with your team in the beginning of a process. There's obviously so much more to learn than in an hour. Yeah, right. Thank you so much to everyone, and to Kelly. It's been really insightful, and I hope to see you all soon.
Thank you for having me. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Kelly.
Okay.
Take care, everyone.
Very good.
Okay.